Hey guys, happy Pride. I know this video has nothing to do with pride, homosexuality, anything. It's just a video about color, but that's precisely the point. It's a video about color. It's a video about rainbows. So the timing was just too good, and since I can't celebrate Pride this month, here we are, gathered together, doing this instead. Let's get started. Oh no, Babo! Guys, say hello to Babo! Ah! He's our new foster kitty and he's so cute. And was whining to come in the room. Okay. Anyway. Quick disclaimer, I'm going to be looking a little bit away from the camera because I'm trying to read the script. My teleprompter situation has still not been resolved, so bear with me a little bit. Also, if I seem to be glancing down, it's because I'm looking at the cat and admiring him. But anyway, why are we discussing this? It seems like every other year I come out with a color theory video, not because I'm trying to build a tradition or anything, but because something in the topic nags me to the point where I just need to make a video. My previous color theory videos, which, by the way, they're all in a playlist on my channel for you to look at, they were all intermediate lectures about the classic color wheel, RYB, and taught practical techniques for implementing the color wheel into your art. I was taught RYB my entire life, from elementary school to high school to university to art school. I personally got a lot out of those lessons, and they really helped me understand how to create the colors and effects I wanted rather than just blindly mixing paint and hoping for the best. When I made those earlier videos about color theory, the RYB model was all I had really learned, so that was all I taught, and those lessons were in line with all the other color theory videos on YouTube. Until recently, that is. It seems like in the past few years, more and more artists have been discussing and praising a different color model called CMYK, aka cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I've heard arguments for replacing RYB with CMY before, but the arguments seemed kind of flimsy and not all that convincing to me. Most articles I found online literally say, CMYK is the best, just look at your printer, and they don't go into any more detail. Printers are loud, clunky pieces of technology that throw fits over the tiniest paper jam. Like, I'm not gonna accept that those monstrosities and the friggin' ink manufacturers are somehow the new gods of color. It's ridiculous, and I'm not accepting just that statement alone as a conclusive answer. To make matters worse, it's actually quite difficult to find rich, deeply researched sources of information about color. It took me literally days of internet searching to find a couple websites that actually went into detail about the different color wheels. Most online articles are incredibly brief with the same repetitive, unhelpful information like, CMYK is the best and my printer proves it. And while there are YouTube videos on the topic, I dislike watching them as primary research material since most YouTubers are just opinionated people with a camera. And it is not at all lost on me that I am also an opinionated person with a camera, but at least I provide a beefy works cited, chock full of information from actual experts in the field, down below. What I'm trying to get at is that I've been more than a bit skeptical of artists championing CMYK, but because of its rising popularity and because of my frustration with the lack of comprehensive information online, I've decided to do my own damn research and find out conclusively what the quote-unquote real color wheel is. Now, I already knew that this is going to be another deep dive video, but oh my god, I did not expect to open Pandora's box of colors. I have gone down the rainbow rabbit hole, and oh my god, there is so much to talk about. So I now realize how impossible it'd be to talk about the different color wheels without thoroughly discussing their origins and all the research, theories, and experiments that were produced as a result. Color cannot be contained just to artistic applications. It has to be explained from multiple points of view, including its scientific, biological, mathematical, philosophical, commercial, and historical context. If you're looking for a video explaining the basics of color theory taught in art school, please click away to my other videos. This is not the video for you. This video is, to the absolute best of my ability, a comprehensive explanation on all things color, or more specifically, the differences between RYB, RGB, and CMY. But before we dive in, I have to list some important disclaimers. Number one, in order for this video to not be 12 hours long, I've taken quite a few liberties by reducing and compressing the most important information I wanted to share. Two, I'm not an expert on this topic, so a lot of historical and scientific detail I'm about to describe are heavily simplified and maybe somewhat incorrect. All the research I've procured for this video comes from real experts in color, so if you want more information, please go to the description box for my works cited. 3. This video focuses on the history of color in the Western world, not the entire world. I wanted to have a more globally inclusive video, but it was surprisingly difficult to find non-Western information, so if you know any cool facts about color history in the Eastern Hemisphere, please let me know by leaving a comment. And 4. The vast majority of this vid is pretty easy to understand, but there will be a couple parts in the science section that may be a bit difficult to follow. I've done my absolute best. It will be pretty quick, just brace yourself. Anyway, on with the video. Antiquity to the 18th century. So all of this color stuff literally goes back to ancient times, starting with Plato, Aristotle, and other famous Greek philosophers. Instead of a color wheel, Greeks thought that color fit into a spectrum of white to black, with lighter value colors like yellow sitting close to white, and darker value colors like blue sitting closer to black. This color/value gradation scale thing actually stuck around till like the 17th century. Color eventually became grouped into warm and cool categories, but not in the way that we see today. There is evidence that in the Middle Ages, blue was considered hot, even the hottest of colors. The very act of mixing color became a cultural taboo, which I suspect is because Christianity believed that white light was considered pure and divine. These rules and taboos meant that medieval artists worked exclusively in flat colors without any kind of shading, and that the clothing industry had strict rules against mixing specific dyes. In some countries, anyone caught dyeing green cloth could face severe repercussions, including large fines and exile. This anti-color mixing phenomenon didn't last forever though, thank God, and by the 17th century, the idea emerged of red, yellow, and blue as primary colors, and green, orange, and purple as secondary ones. This is because the scientific revolution of the 17th century and the Enlightenment of the 18th century shifted the European understanding of theory away from airy concepts and toward observable consequences and practical applications. By 1664, for example, early chemists were studying dyes and pigments in order to improve them, efforts motivated by the huge commercial importance of the textile manufacturers. This stimulated a practical and scientific focus on artistic practice. As scientists began to dabble in color theory, one chemist, Robert Boyle, claimed that the painter's simple and primary colors were black, white, red, yellow, and blue, which could imitate the hues, though not always the splendor, of those almost numberless differing colors found in nature. That last quote by Robert Boyle is really important, but we'll have to get back to it later. First, we need to talk about Newton and his game-changing book, Optics, that came out in 1704. This one book split the artistic and scientific community in half and was a catalyst for centuries worth of research into how we perceive color. Newton rocks the world. You were probably taught Newton's classic experiment of shining light through a prism and creating a rainbow in school, and if you're like me, you probably didn't really give a crap, but oh my god, when that book came out, it completely rocked the artistic and scientific world. For one thing, Newton didn't invent shining a light and creating a rainbow. That was actually well known and considered a parlor trick. Newton, however, went a step further. He used another prism to put the wavelengths back together again. Until then, it had been assumed that the rainbow that pours out of a prism in the path of a beam of light was created by impurities in the glass. Pure white sunlight was considered a gift of God. It was unthinkable that it could be broken down, or worse still, created by mixing colored lights together. Newton took this discovery to proclaim that there were actually 7 primary colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, or RYB. Side note, have you ever wondered about indigo and why this very specific color ended up on our rainbow acronym, RYB, even though it doesn't really seem all that unique like the other colors? Well, there's a reason for that. Newton was trying really hard to have the number of light wavelengths fit with a musical scale, specifically Descartes' 7-tone music scale, which kind of sort of makes sense since sound and light are both wavelengths, but whatever, not accurate and not the point. Newton needed 7 primaries, and to make his color model work, he shoehorned indigo in there for a neat set of 7 special colors. Indigo is a great color, but it was never supposed to be on the color wheel and is one of the several inaccurate facts that came out of optics that has stubbornly stuck around in the 21st century, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, Newton took these 7 primaries and assembled them into a circular color gradient, a model that we're all familiar with even today. He stated that certain color pairings were complements, like red and green or blue and orange, because they sat opposite on the color wheel and seemed to visually resonate when paired together, and that when mixed, they fully neutralized. And finally, he proposed that white and black didn't belong on the color wheel at all because they weren't actually colors. Black was the absence of light and white was a mixture of all colored light. It's at this point that I need to pause and explain what's about to happen. Newton's theory was neither perfect nor complete, but it was a radical shift in how people understood light, color, and how we perceive color. Despite its flaws, it was the catalyst for several centuries worth of scientific discoveries. I now have to split this video into 2 timelines, the scientific and the artistic. Basically, while scientists spent the next couple centuries experimenting and squabbling over new theories about light and color, the artistic world took Newton's color wheel and hardcore ran with it. I'll be discussing what happened in both timelines separately, and then we'll meet back in the 20th century when the ideas finally collide. The scientific timeline. Newton's idea of 7 primaries and his experiments with prisms hardcore clashed with the traditional color theory's RYB primaries. Skeptics of Newton's work were quick with the retorts. Well, what's all this about colors mixing to create white? Mixing paint creates black, not white. And what do you mean there are 7 primaries? Red, yellow, and blue work just fine. What people at the time didn't understand is the difference between additive and subtractive mixing. To put it simply, mixing light is an additive process because all the colors come together to create white. Mixing paint or other physical substances is a subtractive process because all the colors come together to create black. Newton explicitly stated that his research was only for colored light, not paint, but that crucial fact escaped most scientists who continue to conflate additive and subtractive mixing. Because of this, scientists took the color model they already had, i.e. RYB, and kind of shoved it into the research that Newton proposed. A new theory called the theory of 3 spectral primaries proposed that the apparently continuous spectrum was actually made up of red, yellow, and blue rays that overlapped to produce the intermediate hues by intermixture. Newton's research also got a lot of people wondering about how it is that we actually see color. White light creates an infinite number of colors, but there's no way our 2 tiny eyeballs can have like an infinite number of receptors to process all that. There must be a more simplified way. So naturally, scientists at first concluded that because all colored light was apparently a mix of red, yellow, and blue, our eyeballs must be tuned to red, yellow, and blue light. Simple, right? Except that, of course, that wasn't correct. It took another 150 years for scientists to really nail it down, but finally, in 1850, young Helmholtz's theory of 3 fundamental sensations emerged victorious. Turns out, red, yellow, and blue light cannot mix to form all the colors of light, and that the real primaries of light are red, green, and blue, RGB. Note that these are very specifically like a hot red and a lime green and a blue violet color, but for simplicity, we just call them RGB. Our eyes have 3 different receptors called cones that are particularly sensitive to the primaries of light. Now, here's unfortunately where the math comes in. Many years after the young Helmholtz theory came out, scientists James Clerk Maxwell, Arthur Koenig, and others used linear algebra to not only mathematically confirm the young Helmholtz theory, but also to devise a way of graphing every color in the universe. Their work laid the foundation for modern colorimetry, aka the science of color. Isn't that cool? There's a science of color. So you know how Pantone gives each color swatch a unique number? Well, scientists created a similar color system, except it's way beefier because they're literally plotting all the colored light we can and cannot see. It's called the CIE system, and each color's number is its coordinate on a 3D graph. The units of this graph are nanometers, since that's the unit for measuring light wavelengths, and each axis of the graph represents a different color scale, one for lightness, one for hue, and one for hue purity. In order to kind of contain all of these colors and not have negative numbers crop up in their equations, because like what the heck is a negative color, scientists have plotted 3 purely theoretical lights called X, Y, and Z. These values are called CIE primaries because they technically can create all colors in this graphic space. What's important to understand, however, is that these primaries do not correspond with actual colors or components of colors. They're totally imaginary and arbitrary choices that exist solely for mathematical convenience. X, Y, and Z are the theoretical primaries of the color universe. Now, as cool as this sounds, I do have to mention that in 1967 it was discovered that color can't actually be fit into just a 3D graph. It is impossible to represent uniform color differences as a three-dimensional color model. The human color space is non-Euclidean, which means a three-dimensional framework cannot describe it. Any color difference formula or color model that represents color in only 3 dimensions, such as lightness, hue, and hue purity, must produce a distorted or inconsistent picture of color differences and color relationships. So yeah, it's not perfect for plotting all color, but as far as I can tell, it's still used today, and those theoretical primaries still technically exist. Anyway, back to the Young-Helmholtz theory, the idea that our eyes detect red, green, and blue light. Years later, a new theory was added to create one mega theory called the zone theory. Basically, the 3 cones in our eyes aren't assigned to just one color, aka like one for red, one for blue, one for green, as it was previously thought. Instead, all the cones respond to the entire color spectrum to varying degrees. One cone is more sensitive to blue, one is more sensitive to red, one is more sensitive to green, but they can all detect and process all the other colors. When light comes into our eye, the cones each send out a unique signal based on what they're detecting, and the brain calculates the final color based on the differences of the cone's responses. One cone can give off the same reading for a dozen different colors, but because the other cones will give off different readings, the brain understands them as different colors. Now, you'd think that'd be it, right? One quick reading of the cones and boom, we see color. But no. The zone theory proved that even more steps happen after that initial cone reading. Basically, the brain takes the cone reading and then judges it based on 2 color sliders, how red and green the color is, and how yellow or blue that color is. These 2 color combos, red, green, and yellow, blue, are called opponent signals. This discovery means that the brain actually has 4 psychological primaries, red, yellow, green, and blue. When you study how the brain responds to those 4 colors in their most pure states, you'll see that one of the opponent signals will drop to 0 and the other opponent cell will be smack in the middle of the color slider. These 4 opponent hues are often called the 4 psychological primaries because they are the only hue perception that can exist in a unique or pure state, and all other hues being mental mixtures of adjacent pairs of these hues. They are thus the true primary colors in the most literal sense. Now, just like with the CIE lab, I do have to make the disclaimer that this theory is not 100% true and that scientists still do not totally understand how our brain processes color. Color is all smoke and mirrors, and our brains, try as they might, can be easily fooled. Think about that dress that some people thought was blue-black and others thought were white and gold. The image is the same, and our brains are the same, but we still saw different things. And I'm not saying that color illusions are what disproved this theory. I'm just mentioning them because it's important to understand just how bizarre and difficult it is to nail down exactly what the heck our mind is doing when it sees color. So, out of the scientific timeline came 2 new sets of primary colors, RGB for light and RYGB for our psychological understanding of color. And now that we've gotten the difficult stuff out of the way, let's go back in time once more to Newton's color wheel and see how the art world was understanding color. The artistic timeline. Alright, we're back in the 1700s. Newton has just come out with his hot new book, Optics, which states that there are actually 7 primary colors. White and black are not colors, black is the absence of light, and white is a mixture of all colored light. He also named orange, green, and purple as secondary colors and paired one secondary with one primary to create complements. Here's the thing about Newton, though. He had a lot of haters. In the span of 20 years, he proposed a new theory about light being waves, had completely upended the world of physics, and was now changing the way we think about light and color. Aristotelian scholars, English partisans, Cartesian scholars of France and Italy, and continental naturalists all despised Newton because he was discrediting all of their work. So naturally, they looked for any and all falsehoods or contradictions as a way to discredit him. So the 18th century public debate came down to this. Newton's hue circle was based on 7 spectral primary lights and made very specific predictions about the color that would result from any light mixture. For example, according to his hue circle, a mixture of orange light and green light would create the color yellow. Yet these prismatic mixtures were not easily verified by other naturalists, and it was quickly demonstrated that Newton's mixtures did not apply to paints, where orange and green made a cadaverous gray. Not realizing the difference between paint and light mixtures and inflamed by partisan rivalries, Many of Newton's adversaries used paint mixtures and the painter's primaries as proof that Newton's primaries and hence his other color ideas must be wrong, and this wrangle went on for more than a century. A lot of people at the time, including fans of Newton, didn't quite understand everything that he was saying, which led to a domino effect of inaccurate ideas about color. Newton explicitly stated that his color wheel only applied to light, not paint. But in a little over a decade, mathematician, perspective theorist, and amateur painter Brooke Taylor published a book titled New Principles of Linear Perspective that showed how Newton's color circle could be applied to paint. From there, more and more artists started using this color wheel and even began inventing their own color models. These bastardized colored models all had their own unique features, but one thing remained in common. Red, yellow, and blue were considered the primary colors. Because there was so much drama about Newton's findings, and because RYB had been the standard for centuries, and because other scientists were incorrectly conflating Newton's wheel about light with pigment, it makes sense that the artists of the time would just kind of like mush the two ideas together. Like, keep the nifty color wheel with its ideas about complementary colors, but name red, blue, and yellow as the most important of the bunch. So, while yes, these ideas were wrong, and it's maddening to think that literal centuries of artists were using a color wheel based on incorrect information, I do have to admit that some cool new styles of art were created because of these inaccurate theories. For starters, the complementary color thing was a hit, and it made a huge impact on Impressionist painters who took advantage of how the colors jived next to each other to create dazzling paintings. Abstractionist painters in the mid-20th century were particularly obsessed with the primary colors RYB and used them exclusively in their art because of their supposed purity. This is why one of Mondrian's most famous paintings features only red, yellow, and blue colors against black and white. Those colors weren't arbitrary, they had everything to do with the specific artistic philosophy of the time. That said, there were certainly plenty of other artists who really didn't care about the color wheel. Like, take a look at this half-assed sketch by Degas, which doesn't really show a particular interest in color theory. Oh well. History of CMYK. Now, at this point, I can literally hear y'all mentally screaming, okay, but like, what about CMYK? And here's the thing about CMYK. There's actually not a lot of information about how it came to be. Like, it'd be easy for me to just sit here and say, CMYK was introduced in 1906 by printing companies, and it's now considered a better color guide than RYB. But that doesn't really explain how those colors came to be selected as the newer, better primaries. And certainly with all the color lore I've been droning on about, you'd think that these printer developers would use RYB plus black. So why the change, and how was CMYK discovered? The answer to that appears to remain a mystery, for a couple significant reasons. The first is language. The word magenta, as we know it today, describes a very bright, purplish hot pink. But in the 18th and 19th century, magenta described a much darker purple-red color. When exactly the definition started to change is near impossible to figure out, thanks to the second reason: time. Paints and dyes fade, darken, and generally change color over time. So early color swatches showing magenta most certainly do not look the same today as they did when they were first painted. And that's just magenta. Cyan is even a trickier color to nail down because it's such a particularly hard color to describe or find consistently in nature. Even today, your average person could probably name magenta as a color, perhaps thanks to Blue's Clues, but not many know of cyan, or at least they don't use it often enough in their color vocabulary for it to be common knowledge. My guess is that CMY was discovered thanks to advancements in commercialized and industrialized paint. For most of human history, getting pigment was grueling and frankly disgusting work. Indian yellow, for example, was procured from a very specific cow urine. And the other ingredients to make paint, i.e. certain chemicals and binders, didn't always agree with one another, meaning that artists had to be incredibly careful when layering paint or putting paint next to each other on a canvas so that they didn't have a chemical reaction and literally fall apart. And finally, the more exquisite a color, the more expensive it was to purchase. Ultramarine was so expensive in the Renaissance that patrons would have to either explicitly put in their contracts that the artist used that specific paint, or the patrons would have to buy the paint for the artist because the artists were literally too poor to afford that color. All of this changed in the mid-19th century with the invention of chemically created pigments and dyes. Scientist William Perkin, for example, stumbled across the purple dye malvine, aka mauve, while trying to synthesize a cure for malaria in 1856. Once that discovery was made, there was a mad scramble to synthesize other colors of the rainbow. Finally, for the first time in human history, color was no longer procured from incredibly rare resources. For example, the fabulous Tyrian purple was derived from Mediterranean shellfish. Each shellfish could only produce 1 drop of purple, and it took 250,000 to make an ounce of dye. But now, thanks to new technology, pigments could be manufactured, pumped into collapsible tubes, and sold on the market for a much lower price. CMY literally couldn't be used for most of human history because it couldn't be produced. RYB was the best they got. And while some people, like Robert Boyle, quoted earlier in this video, speculated that better primary colors were out there, there really wasn't any way to hunt them down. Technology and manufacturing had to catch up first. But let's get back to our artistic timeline. CMY came out in the early 20th century, but we in the 21st century still predominantly use RYB. So why the heck didn't those colors catch on earlier? The answer is kinda hilarious, but mostly really freaking maddening. Basically, traditional color theory, aka RYB, and modern color theory, aka CMY, coexisted in the first half of the 20th century, to the point where academic texts for artists taught both theories. Long ago, the two primaries lived together in harmony, but then everything changed when Johannes Ittens attacked. Since the 1960s, however, traditional color theories had a renewed and dominant influence on art education, even on a tertiary level, very largely in the form set down in Johannes Ittens' book The Art of Color, which came out in 1961. Ittens' book has been so influential that it defines the limits of artistic color theory for the majority of sources on the internet today. And if that wasn't bad enough, in 1987, another man named Michael Wilcox wrote a best-selling book titled Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green, which hardcore revived the RYB double primary strategy. Thanks to these two books, modern color theory disappeared from artistic textbooks, and traditional color theory went back to dominating the art scene as it had in the 1800s. And to make matters worse, most of us 21st century artists don't even know that this switch happened. As a result of its half-century of ascendancy, many artists today assume that traditional color theory has dominated art education continuously since its origins, and assume modern color theory is a very recent intrusion. RYB versus CMY. So now that we've covered the history of all of these various color wheels and primary colors, let's get into the real boss battle of this video. RYB versus CMY. Which are the real primary colors? RYB has historical significance on its side. If you were to go up the family tree of artists throughout history, the vast majority used RYB and were taught RYB by their teachers. Some of the most famous masterpieces in the world were created using RYB. And I'm sure those of you who have had even the slightest amount of formal artistic education were taught the classic RYB model. It clearly resonates well with artists and has done a darn good job for the past several centuries. But then there's CMY. If you're like me, you grew up being taught RYB from elementary school to university. And if you're like me, you spent countless hours mixing paint using the RYB primaries, and for the most part, were perfectly well off. But not always. Show of hands. How many of you had to paint a still life in class and could not for the life of you get that exact shade of pink, orange, green, blue, or purple? How many of you have been nagged by an art teacher to mix a more accurate color, but couldn't get your colors to cooperate, even after following the advice of your teacher? And how many of you have been frustrated because you couldn't recreate the dazzling colors of a sunset, flower, peacock feather, or countless other objects? We follow the rules and we have all the right paints on our palette, but we still can't get them to cooperate. There were 2 times in my life where I saw through the facade of RYB. The first time was at UConn in my first painting/color theory class. I learned a ton about mixing color from my professor, who, of course, taught the split primary method. None of our still lifes ever used super bright objects, so I was able to create hyper-realistic paintings using RYB, no problem. Until one day. My professor had created 2 still lifes by draping brightly colored fabrics, and after we set up, he told us to pick a still life and start painting. There was this one swath of bright blue-green fabric that several of us were drawn to, and about half the class, including myself, ended up focusing our entire composition around that one fabric. But within a few hours of painting, everyone, including myself, started complaining about how we couldn't get that exact color of the fabric. Mixing even the tiniest bit of yellow made the paint too green, and mixing any amount of white would lower the saturation and make the paint too chalky. Now, I've never told this to anyone, But the only reason I was able to accurately paint that color was because my professor literally snuck me some paint. My color game was strong, so I knew for a fact that my skills weren't to blame. And I had good paint, so that wasn't it either. Literally, it was just that my colors, the ones that supposedly could have mixed any color in the rainbow, could not create that color. The undertone for that fabric was cyan, and there was no way my blues could create it. The second time I had a bad run with color was at Mass Art in an advanced painting class. One of our still lifes featured one of those like translucent rubber balls that kids like playing with, and the way the light hit it created this dazzling shock of neon colors. I tried my absolute best trying to mix those colors to no avail. No matter what I mixed, it was always too dull. My professor, whom I hated, kept harping on me the whole class about getting those damn colors right, but even though I literally mixed all of her suggestions right in front of her, proving that there was no way to do it, she was adamant that I must be doing something wrong and that I should just keep trying. After I finished those introductory classes, my professors stopped caring about what exactly we used, and I gradually started to include cyan and magenta on my palettes. Surprise, surprise, I no longer had issues mixing bright colors. Even with those experiences though, I had a very hard time believing that CMY were the true primary colors. Based on my education, CMY was only for printers and RYB was king. Even in researching for this video, I was convinced that I'd find solid evidence that RYB was right and all those weirdos praising CMY were wrong. But alas, after lots and lots and lots of digging, even I have to admit that those thoughts weren't true. CMY is genuinely a better set of primary colors, at least for artists. So let's take a moment to break down all the various arguments. I'll start with this hypothetical conversation between a teacher and a student that's heavily based off of the one on Handprint's website. Expert, lecturing at the academy. There are only 3 primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. With just these 3 pigments, you can mix any color your heart desires. Really? But look, when I mix 2 primary colors, the resulting secondary colors aren't nearly as saturated as the secondary colors that come straight from the tube. An orange mixed from primary red and yellow is not as bright as pyrrole orange. A green mixed from yellow and blue is not as bright as phthalo green. And a blue violet mixed from blue and magenta is not as saturated as ultramarine blue. How can that be? Yes. But you see, the fault is not with the primary colors, it's in our stars. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. The problem is actually with the paints. Okay, what do you mean? Your primary paints are impure. Those colors in the form of light are perfect for mixing, but once they've been turned into paint, they become tainted by one or both of the other primaries. For example, red paint is impure because it will always have some amount of yellow or blue mixed within. And when you mix all the primaries together, you get a muddied, dull color. The impurities in your paint are what's keeping your primary colors from being the very best they can be. Well, if all paint primaries are tainted, then what should I do? Simple! Just mix a bit of your primary color with both of your other primary colors to create a split primary palette. By having a warm and a cool version of each primary, you'll be able to create all the colors you like. So I have to take my primary colors, which are inherently tainted, and take them even further by mixing them with the other primaries so that I can take those 2 deliberately tainted mixtures to somehow create bright secondary colors? Now you got it. Just be sure not to mix a warm primary with a cool primary because those mixtures won't be nearly as intense. Because you'd essentially be mixing all the primaries together, which creates a dull color? Exactly. But mixing our primaries to create a split primary palette that we then mix further into split primaries somehow works? Exactly. Yeah, sure, that totally checks out. I love primary colors. The fact is, RYB cannot mix all colors and RYB cannot be considered prime because they themselves can be mixed by CMY. Impurities in your paint are not to blame for RYB paint's inability to mix bright colors like magenta and cyan. Red, yellow, and blue, the raw colors, are impure just on general principle because they are already mixtures of 2 other colors. Another common retort is, well, how do you explain the dull colors created by CMYK printers? And for that, there are a few answers. The first has to do with the color conversion between RGB and CMY. Even though these 2 sets of primaries coexist in the world of light, the colors on your screen are additive mixtures, while the colors on paper are subtractive mixtures. Remember Newton and all those people proving his color wheel for light didn't work because paint didn't mix that way? Same idea. The image on your screen has to convert its color language from additive to subtractive before your printer can attempt to recreate it. The second has to do with the material of those colors. The image on your screen is being created with light, literally the purest form of color possible. It can create the hottest pinks, the most neon yellows all day, every day. The image on your paper that's been stamped with layers and layers of ink, though, not a chance. Think of the difference between cartoons on your TV and comic strips in a newspaper. The newspaper is significantly duller because of the properties of the paper itself. Unlike pure light, whose wavelengths are free to be as colorful as they please, wavelengths of ink have to fight against the wavelengths of light reflected off of the paper and thus create a significantly duller look. That said, it's not impossible to print bright colors, you just have to be using the right paper. Think of all the colorful ads printed on the glossy pages of a magazine. That shiny paper does a better job reflecting light, and therefore the colors print brighter. The third and final answer has to do with toner. The specific colors of CMY toner aren't the true CMY colors. Magenta is a little too red, the cyan a little too dark, and the yellow a little too dull. Now, toner companies are freaking terrible, so I wouldn't be surprised if they were cutting costs and slacking on developing proper CMY inks. But even if they did create better toner, they would never be as bright as pure CMY light because, again, light will always be more pure than a colored object. Now, you may be tempted to think, Bianna, didn't you literally just say that RYB doesn't work because the paints are tainted? How is this any different? Dull, cyan, magenta, and yellow paints will still create more vibrant mixtures than the brightest red, yellow, and blue paints. The rule of thumb in color theory is that the more colors you mix, the duller the mixture becomes, because there isn't as much light being reflected back into our eyes. Red, yellow, and blue are already mixed colors because they are created by cyan, magenta, and yellow. Mixing red, yellow, and blue even further just makes duller and duller colors. When you compare paint to light, light will always come out on top because it's the purest form of color. But since we artists aren't mixing light on our palettes, we have to strictly compare paints with paints. Bottom line, CMY are better primaries than RYB. So the final retort to CMY is, of course, well, why the hell do they teach us RYB? If CMY is that great, they'd be teaching that instead. And to that, again, there are a few reasons. Number one, tradition. It's no secret that certain artistic rules get passed down from generation to generation, and the color wheel is no exception. If you get taught RYB from a great teacher, you're naturally going to assume that RYB is the best, and will either use it or teach it yourself. Take me, for example. I learned the color wheel from great professors as well as great artists online, so I taught the same stuff too on my channel. But the longer the cycle of learning and teaching continues, the more cemented it becomes as right. Color theory becomes color rules. That's why the "we've always done it this way" argument is so hard to overthrow. Just the very idea of changing something that's been ingrained for so long is unthinkable. 2. Difficulty to teach. We all learn our colors and how to mix them at a very young age, which is important to our development. The problem is how effing difficult it is to really teach a young child what a specific color means. In English, blue refers to an enormous spectrum of colors, from sky blue to sapphire to indigo to teal. Cyan, as we've discussed before, is a very, very particular hue that isn't seen often in nature, so trying to teach what that color is to a child is incredibly difficult. Think about how easy it is to describe red. There are many different kinds of reds to be sure, but you could take your kid out for a walk and very easily identify what it looks like. The stop sign, the fire truck, the Coke label, the roses, they're all very, very red. But magenta and cyan in particular are far harder to explain. 3. Practicality. Not everyone grows up to be an artist, and most professions don't work with color at all. Most people's color experience starts and ends in elementary school, and that's perfectly fine. I should also restate that the RYB color model isn't bad per se, it's just not the best. So teaching children and other young artists RYB isn't preventing them from developing as an artist, nor is it lying to them about how color works. RYB is just a simpler, more rudimentary version of CMY that can be more easily taught. Now, I have found discussions amongst art teachers about teaching CMY to all students, regardless of interest in the arts, and I think those are great conversations to have. I could be wrong, kids might be just fine learning CMY from the get-go. The point is, I'm not a real art educator, so I'm going to leave that discussion to the professionals. And 4, denial. I'll be the first to admit that I was hardcore in denial about RYB and CMY for a very long time. No one explained the validity of CMY to me in a way that I found reasonable, and my positive experience with RYB made me doubt the supposed benefits of CMY even more. Like I said in point number 1, it's really, really hard to reassess and change your view on something that at one point felt so unquestionable. Those are all the reasons I can think of as to why RYB continues to dominate, but none of them are good enough reasons to not teach modern color theory and act like it never existed. Maybe this is just me, but I'm not particularly worried about which primaries get taught in elementary school. Damn near everything in art has to be hardcore simplified so that students of all ages and talents can enjoy making macaroni masterpieces. We teach kids that to draw an eye, you just draw a football shape, which is super inaccurate, but ultimately isn't really harming anyone in the long run. If a kid has an inclination for the arts, they'll very quickly learn more advanced and accurate stuff. The real problem is RYB still being the only color model taught in higher education, including literal art schools that students are paying tens of thousands of dollars for. Like, there are some benefits of teaching RYB or even the split primary palette, but why the hell are literal art professors not teaching CMY at all? Now, I don't want anyone to start raging against their professors, acting like they've been keeping CMY a secret and are deliberately trying to screw over their students. Like, no. The real problem, I believe, is that it's been 60 years since Johannes Itten's book came out. Proper teaching about CMY was literally 4 generations ago. And because modern color theory has become buried over time, our current teachers may only know RYB and therefore only teach RYB. So, like I said before, I don't think you should rage against specific professors because the real problem is the entire artistic academic system that's teaching RYB instead of CMY. And before anyone starts commenting, LOL, why are you making such a big deal out of this? It's literally just color. Let me read this quote. Traditional color theory and its relationship or lack of relationship to modern color theory is in some ways like that of the so-called creation science to modern biology. The difference is not between science and art, but between the sciences of different eras. Perhaps its most unfortunate effect is that students can become adapted to simplistic treatments of color, making modern color theory seem unnecessarily complicated. If 90% of books treated anatomy or perspective in an extremely simplistic way, you would get a similar shock the first time you saw some real artistic anatomy or perspective. Yeah, maybe it is just colors, but those colors are literally so freaking important to an artist's development. Color supports lighting, composition, rendering, form, and so many other aspects to a single piece. Young artists who are trying to become professionals are wasting so much time learning outdated information when they could, and should, be upping their color game the second they enter higher education. Not to mention, it's one hell of a waste of money to pay for a class on color theory only to be taught information that's literally over a century out of date. We can do better, people. The solution to all of this is to do your own research and teach others, which, by the way, you're kind of doing right now just by watching this video. And thanks to social media, it's easier than ever before to spread the word. Just sharing this video and liking and subscribing would do a lot. Not because I'm the all-knowing source of color research, but because this video may be a good starting point for people who wanted more in-depth knowledge on color. And hey, maybe reach out to your department head and see if they'll update the curriculum. The more noise we make, the more likely things will change for the better. Final thoughts. What are the real primary colors? I started this video posing the question, what are the real primary colors? And I hope by now you've realized what a ridiculous question this is. A major theme is that primary colors are either imaginary or imperfect. That is, primary colors are either imaginary sensations that you cannot see, and colors you can't see aren't really colors, or they are actual lights or paints that cannot mix all possible colors, which means they aren't really primary. So you could say primaries don't exist and be technically right, but saying they don't exist undermines all the valuable research gone into finding 5 real sets of primary colors. Though these primaries aren't perfect in the absolute strictest sense of the word, they have immense value in the artistic and scientific communities and are plenty strong enough to stand on their own. So, setting aside that philosophical mumbo-jumbo, here's a list of the 5 very real sets of primary colors. Number 1, RYGB, the 4 psychological primaries. These are the primary colors of the brain. We experience these and only these as pure hues and all other hues as mixtures of these. RGB, the primaries of light. Since color are just wavelengths of a specific spectrum of light, RGB are the primaries of everything we see. They are also the primaries of our cone cells, which first detect and process color. XYZ, the 3 theoretical mathematical primaries. These colors exist only in numbers and equations for colorimetrists. CMY, the 3 best primary color and hues actually available. These colors are the best for artists. And then lastly is RYB, the historical primaries. The three historical primaries are thus a confusion of, but also in a sense, the ancestors of, both CMY and the four psychological primaries. It's tempting to say that RYB doesn't deserve to be on this list considering how wrong and outdated it is, but as David Briggs so aptly put it, it is counterproductive to the wider acceptance of modern color theory as well as misleading to dismiss the red, yellow, and blue primaries as merely obsolete or worse to insist that primary colors do not exist. The three historical primaries were as much a step towards recognition of the four modern psychological primaries as they were an imprecisely named set of color mix-in primaries. Without RYB, we wouldn't have any of the color knowledge we have today. It's important that we embrace the past and all the lessons it contains, but take advantage of all the better, more current information we can enjoy today. If there's one overarching theme to this video, it's the importance of learning and accepting new knowledge instead of clinging to old ideas. Had scientists in the 18th century put aside their pride and actually cared to understand Newton's work, we would have understood how our eyes and brains process color a lot faster. And had artists not stubbornly stuck with traditional color theory, we'd have 4 generations worth of color-savvy artists. It's really easy to ignore new information, theories, and values because they conflict with what you've always known, but by choosing to cling to outdated beliefs, you become a blockade to progress. Which side of history do you want to be on? So, before I sign off, I want to give a little shout out to my main resources for this video. Everything is linked neatly down below, but there are a few sources that deserve some props. First has got to be handprint.com, created by Bruce McAvoy. I cannot stress enough how enormous this website is, and how intensely and extensively it goes into every facet of color you could think of and then some. It is literally the most comprehensive source about color and how it can be applied to painting. I will admit the website design is old and clunky, making it really difficult to navigate, and the information is so freaking advanced that it took me dozens of rereads to fully understand a single section, but by God, is it worth diving into. Second goes to huevaluechroma.com, created by David Briggs. A lot of the topics discussed on handprint are explained in slightly easier to understand language, though it is still a challenge. And there's tons of handy visuals, and he even has a YouTube video covering most information on his website. Again, I can't recommend it enough. Finally, we have the book, The Secret Lies of Color by Kassia St. Clair. It contains the history and stories behind 75 hues, colors, and dyes, all organized in rainbow order. It is such a delight to read, and it's incredibly fascinating, and it makes for a great gift for anyone even remotely interested in art, history, color, or fun facts. And honorable mention goes to RYB by Jude Stewart. It's basically the same version as this, but like shorter and punchier little stories, more fun facty. It's fun. Everything else is sourced down below, and I highly recommend taking a quick look through. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm not an expert. I hardcore simplified a lot of core information, so please spend an afternoon reading, learning, and enjoying. Please let me know down below if you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching. Happy Pride, like I said at the beginning of the video, and I hope you guys are doing well. See you, have a good one. Bye!